All right, we ready? All right, everybody there? This would also be a good opportunity if there are terms that you might have along the way, just to let me know, or issues with terms along the way. So we left off here with the breakdown of colonial society. Some of this is a little bit of a review we've kind of covered, but some of it's new. So obviously there is an opportunity to go from rags to riches. You could get out of having to deal with the primogeniture problems of Europe or debtor's prison, and you have the opportunity to easily own land or the opportunity to easily get a job in the new world. But there are obstacles. You know, you've got disease, you've got famine, you've got Native American attacks, you've got rivalries with other empires as well. Class differences do emerge. Okay, you have your aristocrats, your wealthy planters, your merchants, your officials, clergymen, surveyors. These are your people at sort of the top of the food chain. And then you've got, like we talked about that, you know, example, i.e. the FFVs, First Families of Virginia would fall into that category. And then somewhere between the upper class and the middle class would also be like the surveyors, the rum producers, the whiskey producers, gun manufacturers, artisans, entrepreneurs. And that merchant class obviously grows more in New England than the Middle Atlantic. Smuggling was big business in colonial America. We're going to talk a little bit about smuggling and how from colony to colony and from port to port, smuggling was viewed differently in different places because it depends on who's in charge of that particular port or colony and whether the smugglers are going to be allowed to do that or whether they're going to be brought to justice. Most of the time, a blind eye was turned because kickbacks and graft wound up into the pockets of those colonial officials and people in charge of clamping down on the smuggling. Yeoman farmers, these are small farmers. They made up the largest population in colonial America from New England to south. They fall into that middle class. Not all of them were middle class. Some made more money than others. In some cases, they owned slaves, but most of them had large families. They owned, in some cases, they owned their own land. Indentured servants were by far the lowest level of white settlers in colonial America. You could also make an argument for like Scots-Irish because a lot of them didn't have the opportunity to own land as well. Some poor English. Obviously that indentured servant system of Scots-Irish and English is phased out in the 1700s. Slaves were at the bottom of the social ladder, starting sort of at the top with free African Americans, and then we would have seen indentured Africans and then chattel slaves at the bottom there. Some free African Americans are going to have the opportunity to own land and carve out a free life, but one thing they're not going to have the opportunity to do is do what? That really holds them back. Vote. They don't have the right to vote, nor do they have the right to run for office. So if we think about that, we have to really look at, was a racial class system really developed in colonial America on purpose at the turn of the 18th century? And I would say yes, most certainly. So colonial merchant class at the dawn of the American Revolution. We've got this Cooper working here. We've got a Continental officer. We've got some merchants, cannons, Conestoga wagons in the background, stuff getting loaded onto ships. That is what the colonial merchant class looked like in the 1770s. All right, so let's look at some skilled professions we haven't really gotten that far into in depth. The most well-respected and honored position by far was clergy. They wielded the most power and authority from colony to colony. The colonial church dominated colonial society. The two established churches, though, are going to be the Anglican Church in the south and the Congregationalist Puritan Church in the north. Physicians, not really all that highly esteemed, because not all physicians really needed a degree, right? You probably wouldn't feel all that, you wouldn't be too thrilled if you said to your doctor, hey, where did you go to med school? And they said, actually didn't go to med school. You probably, maybe a red flag would go on. If your physician said, nope, never went to med school, was a butcher for a while, well, that's great. Or never went to med school, was a barber for a while, got a steady hand, thank you. So that is kind of like the sort of ebb and flow of, that's sort of like ebb and flow of the colonial doctor, where some of them actually were professionally trained and had apprenticeships, but a lot of them didn't. And you can imagine that it was very difficult to get a skilled European doctor to come over to colonial America to maybe live a life that was, you know, quite dangerous and very rural. Okay? Over time, this gets better, but do keep in mind, we're like over 100 years away from germ theory in this period of the colonial era. A lot of these strategies are very archaic, right? And they are way out of date. And some of these archaic strategies that are used are going to be used for like another 100 years. In fact, one of these particular strategies that was one of the most famous was called bleeding. Has anybody ever heard of the bleeding method before? Okay, we're going to see, I'm going to show you an example of this later. It's a box that was full of razor blades, and they would basically apply the box to your arm, and they would say, oh, like let's say, you know, Mr. E is really sick. He's coming, I don't know if you can tell, I like picked up a cold for my daughters. And man, Mr. E's cold's getting worse. We really should just bleed out some of that bad blood from Mr. E's body. And they lay me down, and they're like, it's crazy. It's this box that looked like almost like a pill box, and they would press it down, and the razor blades would just cut into you, and they would bleed your blood into a bucket. And they're like, we're going to get all that bad blood out. Obviously, that's not real.
Wait, Mr. Reed, you're saying that's not how you
Wait a minute, that doesn't seem right. The bleeding method seems awesome. Yeah. Leeches are going to be used at this period of time as well. That is a really good question. And leeches become more and more popular even as germ theory gets closer, because it was probably safer to use leeches than it was to use the, I know that sounds super sick and gross, but it would have been safer to use leeches than to use a razor blade, because if you catch a main artery with one of those razor blades, they're probably not going to be able to save you. And that was a common problem, where they're like, oh, sorry, this guy's done, you know. Whereas the leeches, you know, that was like a little bit more. And again, leeches, yeah, for sure. Leeches are still used around the world. The reason I wanted to, like the bleeding thing, that doesn't stop until up to the Civil War, right? And the one person that is very famous that dies due to the bleeding method is George Washington. He had a throat ailment. He should have just, you know, been given some rest and cared for, and been allowed to get over it, but they decided they would do the bleeding method, and he lost so much blood that he couldn't recover. So he ends up dying of the throat ailment, but as a result of the bleeding method. Iris, I'm going to look up, or if you guys want to look it up, see how far back the earliest leech. I think the leech method was used probably as early as the late 1600s, definitely by the 1700s in colonial America. Really famous doctor in colonial America that's sort of like the exception to the rule is Zebediah Boylston. He's from Boston. He is going to come up with the inoculation process for smallpox. He first tried it on his family, which was really a kind of a crazy thing. Basically, he takes some pus or a scab from a smallpox victim and then just basically inoculates him and his family, giving them all smallpox. They manage to get through it and no more smallpox, right? But it's dangerous because, people will die from this method. So we're not yet at the process of vaccination, just the inoculation process. So this Boylston's inoculation method, though, really is a turning point in the American Revolution because Washington will have the Continental Army inoculated, and that will turn the tide of the American Revolution for the Continental Army, the Patriots during the war. Some other important things to point out that Boylston accomplished in colonial America. He was the first physician to perform a successful surgical operation in colonial America. He was the first doctor to successfully remove gallstones in colonial America, and he was the first doctor to successfully remove a cancerous breast tumor in colonial America. So it's a pretty big deal. Lawyers and jurists early in the colonial American period were not all that respected, but over time, as law programs become better and more laws are passed to provide for fair trials, then lawyers and justices get more recognition and respect. With that being said, programs like Harvard, William & Mary, and Yale will develop law programs as the colonial period moves forward. One guy in particular is George Wythe. He's like the most brilliant law professor in colonial America. He teaches law at William & Mary. A couple of his very famous pupils will be Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall. So more high-profile lawyers come about, and people are going to want their representation. One in particular would be John Adams, who was working in and around Boston, and he will end up defending the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre in 1770. He had studied law at Harvard. So here we have Zebediah Boylston on the left, George Wythe on the right. Has anybody ever been to St. John's Church up in Churchill? All right, if you've never been, I'm going to try to get us up there. George Wythe is buried at St. John's Church. Interesting deal. George Wythe was he was trying to get a law passed in Virginia that would allow for African Americans to testify and to receive a trial. What's that? Yeah. So George Wythe High School in Richmond, George Wythe High School in southwestern Virginia. There's buildings and all kinds of places all over Virginia named in honor of George Wythe because he educated all of these founding fathers in law. And then he is going to try to get African Americans this right to be able to receive trials by jury, but also testify. Turns out his nephew was a cut out of his will. So his nephew had him poisoned. And the only person that knew what was going on was but George Wythe's caretaker and house slave. She witnessed she knew all this had gone down, and there was no way that she could testify against his nephew. So it's kind of a really ironic twist of historical fate for George Wythe and sort of George Wythe's legacy. Yeah.
What was that church called again?
St. John's Church is where Patrick Henry gave his Liberty or Death speech. You ever been up there?
No, but is there like, I don't know,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it would be, for John the Baptist. So, yeah. Talk about that later. No, same, yeah, it's just different place. So, colonial labor force, agriculture obviously was the main business. A lot of farming. Remember, more cash crops in the South, tobacco in Virginia and Maryland. A lot of flour and grain and wheat in the Middle Atlantic. That's why the Middle Atlantic was known as the breadbasket. A lot of cod fishing and shipbuilding in New England. Remember, New England, they said, was built on cod and God. Ha ha ha. Isn't that funny? Because, they're Puritan and the fish. Get it? Trading was also a big, popular, prevalent industry throughout colonial trade cities. Remember, colonial trade cities were not just the big colonial urban centers like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston and Charleston. You also have colonial trade centers like Portsmouth, Providence. You've got Baltimore. You've got Norfolk, Williamsburg. Well, Williamsburg depends on Norfolk, and you've got New Bern, North Carolina, Savannah, Georgia. Those are just to name a few. A lot of hunting, trading, trapping, and small subsistence farming in the backcountry of Virginia, Shenandoah Valley. Remember, the triangular trade creates that system known as mercantilism. So say you got rum coming out of New England, and you got tobacco coming out of Virginia, and it's going to England. And then England is going to take those chairs and tables and pots and pans and weapons, and they trade them to Africa. And then Africa is going to sell those slaves, and they're going to be traded to America. And this whole process keeps going. That's the triangular trade mercantile system. And that whole thing was, they are saying the the English colonies, no matter if they're timber or tobacco or agricultural products, are going directly to Africa or down to the Caribbean or out to England, the mother country depends on the colonies providing their natural resources to develop finished products. That's why there became this sort of saying called Britain first, and it made the colonial citizens feel like what? Well, yes, language please though. Made them feel pretty bad. Made them feel like second-class citizens, right? All right, moving right along. Skilled craftspeople, artisans were highly prized. So blacksmith, tanners, which were leather makers, coopers, apparel makers, cobblers, shoemakers, gunsmiths. Remember, manufacturing, it made a lot of money, but it was a small endeavor at this time because the mother country didn't want the colonies doing a lot of manufacturing. So we're looking at rum, lumber, eventually textiles. Britain marked their tallest trees for the Navy's masts. And this goes back to that whole thing where at the end of the day, who cared what trees were getting picked? Because all of these trees, there was plenty of lumber and they all went to the common good. But that Britain first ideology was detested. Colonies were forced into a mercantile system, as I mentioned before. And one way we already know about this, we talked about navigation laws that had been passed. But here's an example of one, the Molasses Act of 1733. It wasn't really followed through with, but it's just an example of or basically how England was trying to prevent any other competition with their colonies. They didn't want their colonies buying French sugar so they could produce rum. They didn't want their colonies buying Dutch chairs or Dutch tables. And they certainly didn't want any of those empires to be getting any of their resources as a result. Meaning they didn't want the French getting lumber that could wind up in the British Navy. They didn't want the Dutch coming up with tobacco that England should be distributing. It didn't matter though, smuggling was big business and everybody made a lot of money off of it. So a lot of trade existed with the British Empire's rivals anyway. One guy that made a fortune off of smuggling was John Hancock. What do we remember John Hancock for? His signature. Very good. We remember him for the signature on the Declaration of Independence. But we probably don't know, how did he get there? How did John Hancock get in a position where he was signing the Declaration of Independence before anyone else? The reason he was able to do that is because he was wealthy. Okay? He made a fortune off of smuggling. He smuggled anything that could float. Wine, tea, tobacco, you name it, he smuggled it. But he also had a very wealthy uncle. And he inherited his uncle's fortune as well. John Hancock, ladies and gentlemen, he bankrolled the American Revolution. All right? And he wanted a military command, but there's one thing that he didn't have that George Washington did. What's that?
Experience?
Yes, thank you very much, Quinn. He didn't have the military experience. So putting John Hancock in command of the Continental Army probably wasn't going to be your best bet. But making him president of your political organization, the Second Continental Congress, well, that would work out okay. So this was an appointment that was made largely in part to the fact that this man helped finance the Continental Patriot cause. Here we have colonial smuggling. I like this. Just sort of, it's like, this painting is like just so shady. It's great. Literally smuggling in a shady, foggy location. That's awesome. Colonial religion, another piece of review. Are there any questions I can answer about colonial employment before we move forward? Again, this is a lot of what we've already discussed, kind of bringing it all back together. Remember that churches were tax supported, so in order to be a member, you were a tax-paying parishioner. There are two established, quote-unquote, established tax-supported churches. The Puritan Congregationalist Church in New England and the Southern Anglican Church. The Anglican Church, mainly in Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland had Catholics, but also Anglicans. Part of New York, also a haven for Jews and French Huguenots. Anglican sermons typically shorter, less description of hell, a little less frightening, a little more amusements. They participated in lotteries and gambling. Guys, relax over there, please. Thanks. They didn't really have a resident bishop, so this is what is going to lead to them establishing a college for ordained ministers in Colonial Virginia, and that's why William and Mary becomes the place to educate and train young Anglican clergy members. The Congregationalists grew out of Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth and other colonial societies, New Haven, Connecticut, even Rhode Island to a degree. Quakers dominated Pennsylvania, Presbyterians, New Jersey. Quakers established University of Penn. Presbyterians established Princeton. All right. In the early 1700s, a large religious movement spreads from England and in Europe to the Americas, and it was known as the Great Awakening. So this is Puritan religion in the colonies. you're in a rural area, you're going to a log cabin. This log cabin is your church. You've got your Puritan style clothing on, but notice everyone else is also, or the men are also what? Notice what the men have. They are armed. Yes, they're armed. They're prepared for battle if they need to be against the Native American attack. Laws have been passed in the House of Burgesses for the same purpose. Yeah. There's another Great Awakening that will occur 100 years later. So the timeline on that, the first Great Awakening, 1730s, second Great Awakening, 1830s. Yeah, 100-year separation. All right, so the movement happens in Europe. This is around, kind of around the time of the Enlightenment in Europe, because we're about to see the Enlightenment make its way to America as well. Preachers believed that Americans were less religious and that religious fervor had escaped them and they needed to be indoctrinated, they needed to repent. But what's important that you guys understand is that this leads to some new denominations that are going to evolve out of this, all right? So, for example, Protestants started to adopt the doctrine of the Arminians that was led by a Dutch reformist named Jacobus Arminius. He preached free will, good works, eternal fate, and the Arminius movement leads to the establishment of Queen's College, who later became known as Rutgers University. Dutch reformists started to challenge Orthodox Calvinists. Dutch reformists had previously been the established religion of New Netherland and New Amsterdam. All right. Another Great Awakening denomination that is born is going to be the Baptist faith, the Methodist faith, the Presbyterian faith. These are Protestant movements that arise out of this. All right? People start to go around and preach and teach in a revival style sermon. Has anybody ever been to a revival before? Okay? Imagine like going to a circus or a sporting event or like a major event under like a tent or maybe out in a field, and instead of it being, or like a concert rather, but instead of there being like a sports event or a group of trapeze artists or a singer, it's a group of preachers that are basically rotated in and out to preach to all the people. And it is with a lot of fanfare. And people traveled out to go see these evangelical sermons that brought people to tears and made them repent and made them come forward and give their lives. And in some cases, they were baptized right on the spot. So evangelical revivals were, and again, the reason I am saying I compare it to like a concert, a sporting event, or a circus, it was a big deal because a lot of people were living in rural areas of America or colonial America, and they didn't have a lot of major events. So an evangelical revival would have been a major source of entertainment at this period of time. So what these guys are going to do, these preachers, they're going to ride around and they're going to start preaching the Jeremiads that we talked about before, these sermons. Some of them are like fire and brimstone, and they move people to not only tears but also to empty their wallets. So one guy in particular is going to be Jonathan Edwards. He was a Congregationalist preacher, which meant he was of the Puritan faith. The Great Awakening had a major effect on him. He was Harvard educated. He is going to describe eternal damnation that non-believers would face after death. And he lays this out in Sinners of the Hands of an Angry God. And in that sermon he describes man dangling a spider over a blazing fire, able to drop the spider at any time, just as God could do to man. Did I say man dangling a man? Good, thank you. Man dangling a spider over a flame. And then the the road to hell is paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. Also part of the Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon. So here's Jonathan Edwards. Edwards was inspired by, here's the answer to your question from earlier, George Whitefield. Whitefield was the most famous of all the evangelical preachers and speakers. He was sought after. If he was coming near your town or to your town, people were going to show up, right? And this, again, he was an orator with rare gifts that he would bring Edwards to tears. He had people like Ben Franklin, who Ben Franklin was not a religious man, not all that pious, would reach in his pockets and donate to the collection plate. A lot of imitators copied Whitefield's emotional, shaking sermons, throwing his hands in the air as was famous in his speeches and sermons. This led to a group known as the Circuit Riders that would ride with Bibles in saddlebags and deliver Bibles out into the rural areas. Something that the Great Awakening did, guys, the Great Awakening is going to hit on three important factors that I want you guys to take note of. I want everybody to pay attention to this. It is going to play on the fact that people were scared and they didn't have a life expectancy that was all that long necessarily, and they had a lot of obstacles and a lot of ways to die. And I know that sounds funny. You're like, yeah, no kidding, Mr. E. There's a lot of ways to die. Of course there is. But what I'm saying is, chances of us getting smallpox is probably pretty slim, right? Chances of me coming down with yellow fever this evening, probably not going to happen, right? Chances of me getting attacked by a black bear this afternoon, I'd probably have to really put myself in that situation. So, you know, are the Wampanoag going to launch an attack this evening on my home? Probably not. Okay? It's not going to happen. So, what I'm saying is there were a lot of things that would make these people seek out faith. Okay? So that's number one. Number two, the other thing that is happening here is that there is not a lot to do. Okay? And if there's a community event where you can maybe have a potluck and, you know, everybody cook and bring some food, have a nice little festival, you know, we share in some religious teachings, preachings, repent a little bit, maybe even hand our lives over to Christ and eat some home cooking, that could bring us together closer as a community during the colonial period. So that was another thing that the Great Awakening was able to tap into. The third thing that I want you to really dial in on here is that it is going to tap into the revolutionary spirit. And that is, I don't believe in the king, you know, King George. I believe in the King of Kings, right? I don't have to follow the law of an English king. I follow the law of God. So those three factors are significantly important when talking about what the Great Awakening was all about. It really tapped into these, not only people's faith, but it tapped into a deeper ideology. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Okay. All right. So what some of the old lights weren't too keen on the new lights. In fact, some old light congregationalists, they would come up on a New Light Baptist sermon, and they would grab the preacher and take him down and dunk his head in the water till near drowning, as saying, like, you know, you're an imposter. You know, you're not a real preacher. And this kind of thing happened. It was common. It didn't happen a lot, but it happened enough to be documented historically. The New Lights, though, they created congregations, but they also created new colleges. Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth, they were all New Light centers of education. And all of these schools are still around and really solid colleges to this day. And then again, as I said before, it's going to help inspire the ideas and ideology of the American Revolution. Here we have George Whitefield on the left, and then this is a George Whitefield revival during the Great Awakening on the right. Schools and colleges established. This is a bit of a review. Remember, more education and more emphasis on education in New England and the Middle Atlantic. So whether it be the community coming together to have, like, you know, that one-room schoolhouse that Ichabod Crane teaches in. Y'all remember Ichabod Crane, Legend of Sleepy Hollow? Yeah, I hope so. Okay. If not, it's all good. We'll talk about it a bit later. Or maybe you've got a one-house schoolroom that is in an urban center. There's more emphasis of that in New England and the Middle Atlantic. Germans bring over kindergarten, that principle of primary education. Primary schools are developed throughout Middle Atlantic and New England. More people were literate in New England than any of the other colonies. There were more newspapers in circulation, more Bibles printed in this area as well. Farm labor dictated, the agrarian calendar dictated the school calendar, as it still does in a way today in most places. That's a little bit more complicated. We'll talk about that later. In the South, it was a little different. Most education was done at the home. But if you were really well-to-do, you would likely be sent away to either a family member or you would be sent away to Europe to be educated. So I'll give you a good example of this. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was sent to Tuckahoe Plantation to receive his primary education. He was educated in a one-room schoolhouse, and then he was sent back to Albemarle County. He receives the next level of his education there, and then he's sent to William and Mary. And in some cases, like I said, the kids would be sent to Europe to be educated and then return to the colonies, or maybe not return to the colonies. Colonial schools were based on religious doctrine, orthodoxy. Later, there's going to be some changes in focus on the classics. Law programs will spread to colonial colleges. Discipline was severe. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Liberal arts and science comes into curriculum as a result of the Enlightenment in Europe. And Ben Franklin helps launch an early version of high school and helps establish the University of Pennsylvania. I changed up the picture there. I thought this one was pretty cool. There's the statue of Ben Franklin at UPenn. Colonial art movement. As I said before, I find it important to talk about art and literature. So, not a lot of time for recreation due to farming and staying alive in the colonial period. So most free time was used for religion and less on art. But, you know, painters do come about, and a lot of painters were frowned upon by pursuing a worthless talent with their pastime, which I say, boo. Art is an important talent to use in your pastime. And the American art movement takes off in the late 1700s and in the early 1800s is when that's sort of like the birth of our American art movement. Here are the things that inspire our American art movement. Number one is the colonial experience itself. Number two is the Great Awakening. Number three is the American Revolution. And number four is the spirit of manifest destiny, the idea that America should move west. All right? We're going to see that come about in our artwork as we move forward. Some of these key artists, we got John Trumbull of Connecticut. He was discouraged at home to pursue his career in art. He actually ends up in the Continental Army, and that experience will influence his career, and he becomes one of the most revered and popular artists in American history. Charles Wilson Peale of Philadelphia, we've seen one of his works. Remember the portrait of George Washington in the uniform, the red Virginia militia uniform that we saw. He also establishes the first natural history museum in Philadelphia. Stuffed birds, practice dentistry. He'll take on, did you all know that Lewis and Clark brought bear cubs back? Thomas Jefferson sent them back, and they lived on the executive lawn for a time. They got too big, so he had to do something with them, so he gave them to Charles Wilson Peale. So Charles Wilson Peale was basically running an art history museum and a zoo for a time. I know, that happens, they do that. Well, they got a little too big and they had to be euthanized eventually. Yeah, it was a sad ending of the life of these bears. But, yeah, they were taken off of these bear cubs were captured by Lewis and Clark with a lot of other, wildlife and sent back to Jefferson. All right, we'll get into that later. Benjamin West, we already saw the painting that West did, William Penn, and the the treaty with the Lenape Delaware Indians. And then John Singleton Copley, we haven't seen any of his works yet. He is a Boston-trained painter, and Peale actually studied under Copley. So you've all seen this one on the left. That's a Trumbull work, the painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. FYI, it looked nothing like that. And then on the right, how many people have seen that portrait of Jefferson? That's an original Peale. On the left here, is anybody familiar with the guy that's dying in the middle of this painting? His name's James Wolfe. Have you ever heard of him before? He's a really famous British general that led the colonists at the Battle of Quebec. And this particular painting is The Death of James Wolfe. Pretty famous one from the end of the French and Indian War. And then on the right, this is a Copley portrait of a really famous silversmith. It is not Jack Black, no, as somebody said in one of my other classes. It does look like Jack Black. Paul who? Paul who? Paul Revere, very good. I don't know who said it, but Paul Revere, silversmith, who did one of the famous rides to let folks know that the British or the regulars were coming. And then this is a self-portrait of Peale in 1822 of his Natural History Museum, one of his turkey vultures that he stuffed there, some fossils on the right. All right, so the provincial culture, by the mid to late colonial period, the Georgian style of architecture was adopted. Symmetry, proportion, classical red brick Georgian style. How many people know what I'm talking about? That red brick Georgian style of Williamsburg, William and Mary, a lot of the buildings at the University of Virginia, a lot of the buildings in Richmond are Georgian style architecture. Log cabin borrowed from Sweden. Colonial literature takes off in this era. A couple of people want to talk about Phyllis Wheatley. She was an African slave that became the first African American woman to be a published author. Her publications were in support of the American Revolution. She gained her freedom in Boston and published poems on various subjects, religious and morals. Ben Franklin published Poor Richard's Almanac, obviously the most influential publication in colonial America next to the Bible. Household hints, forecasts, puzzles, amusement, quips and phrases like a penny saved is a penny earned. Three may keep a secret if two of them are dead. I think that's pretty comical. And again, the almanac was widely read throughout colonial America. Cody, question.
How did Phyllis legally, how was she allowed to
After she gained her freedom, she was like spoke. So a mistress taught her how to read and write, but she was picking up extra languages. She was like fluent in 3 languages. So she ends up starting to write. They get published in local newspapers, and people start to take notice. And then she's sponsored to be sent to England to write and be published. This was very, very rare. This would have happened for any woman, much less a woman that was formerly a slave, born into slavery now, or born not necessarily into slavery, but sold into slavery from Africa. And one of her biggest fans was actually George Washington during this era. Remember Ben Franklin's experiments with science, the lightning rod. Obviously, he helps with advancements in science and everyday life that we still hold near and dear today, like the odometer, right? Bifocals. Not that I'm using them yet, but who knows? On the left there, we have Phyllis Wheatley. On the right, Poor Richard's Almanac. That's the first publication in 1733. John Peter Zenger trial. Well, let me just hang here for a second and talk a little bit about this. Few libraries are found early in colonial America. That's another thing that Ben Franklin spearheads in Philadelphia, and other public libraries get going. Prior to the Revolution, most printing presses were in urban centers, and so you had hand-operated presses that would crank out leaflets, pamphlets, and journals. One of the most famous was Ben Franklin's, and a lot of these people did their pamphlets and their critiques and their papers and their pamphlets under pseudonyms, like pen names, or they just did them anonymously. So, for example, Poor Richard and Mrs. Silence Dogood were 2 of Ben Franklin's pseudonyms, but there were other even more controversial pamphlets, like, have you ever heard of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, where he inspired the grievances of the American Revolution? Did you all know that that was published by Ben Franklin? Maybe? Did you know that it was published anonymously? Maybe. That was common at this period of time. John Peter Zenger, though, he was publicly, he was a German-American New York newspaper printer who produced the New York Weekly Journal. And what he did was he wrote a story about how the colonial governor, William Cosby, had removed Chief Justice Lewis Morris, and it was a ruling over Morris's salary, but it impacted Cosby because he was going to make more of a profit off of it. So in this particular story, Cosby sued John Peter Zenger for seditious libel. You know what seditious libel is? It's basically when you accuse an important official or a government official of lying to screw you or the people over. All right? So that's kind of what it comes down to. So like seditious libel is a really seditious libel is basically saying that, you know, you are like, if you were to sue me for seditious libel, I would be falsely ruining your character, right? So in this particular trial, Cosby had the upper hand here. There was nothing to say that John Peter Zenger had a shot at winning this trial. But thanks to a high-profile lawyer by the name of Andrew Hamilton, a jury and a fair judge, they ruled that Hamilton's story was not seditiously libel. It was in fact true, and he won his case. This is a huge victory for free press in colonial America. Did that make sense to everybody? The idea of seditious libel? 'Cause I'm going to bring it up again a bit later. We're not done talking about seditious libel. All right. This is the trial of John Peter Zenger, a victory for the free press. All right, so politics. By the dawn of the Revolution, 8 of the 13 colonies were had royal governors appointed by the king. 3 had governors chosen by proprietors. Nearly all of the colonies had 2-house legislative bodies with an upper and a lower house based off of royal appointments and those elected by the people, which sounded a whole lot like what governmental body in England? Parliament. Great job, guys. You got that faster than anybody so far. Parliament. House of Lords and House of Commons. So it looks similar to that. Most governors did a decent job, but not everyone was popular, right? And in one case, there was a very unpopular governor that did a very bad job, and his name was Lord Cornbury. Did anybody research Cornbury in here? Okay, so he was the first cousin of Queen Anne, was made governor of New York and New Jersey, but he robbed the treasury and embezzled nearly all the money from the colonial treasury. All right, he was relieved from his post, but it led to a near rebellion. And similarly, we have Lord John Murray Dunmore, who will replace the colonial, he'll come into colonial Virginia, and he leads to the revolutionary acts that cause members of the House of Burgesses to, well, be dismantled and start to talk about a call for arms. Okay? There would have never been a Virginia Convention where Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," to take up arms against the royal governor, if not for how poorly Lord Dunmore led the people of colonial Virginia. Okay? Remember, the right to vote was not available to just anyone, just white male landowners 21 or older. And do keep in mind that acquiring land, was not, you had to work hard to get land, so that voting right was a pretty significant privilege, but it was only held by one group. Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg. Has anybody ever been in here? Yeah, you've probably been in there before. Yeah, of course. You go in the front, they've got their little bar, it's not, you can't go in there and like booze it up in this day and age. It's like all like how it originally looked during the colonial period. But you go in there, they've got the bar, they've got the tables, and in the back they've got the little billiard room, right? The reason I wanted to pull this is because a lot of colonial politics were done at the taverns. And this is an important tavern in American history, because when Lord Murray Dunmore dismantled the House of Burgesses, many of those guys, this was the first place they went to figure out what their next step was going to be. So, again, colonial taverns are an important part of and meeting places are an important part of the politics. So some colonial folkways. Remember, there's a lot of hardships. So basic amenities were very difficult. There's no running water. There's no plumbing. There's no garbage disposal. All that's very primitive. The amusement had to be done either at the hearth in the home or in the communities. So you would try to take any opportunity you could get to maybe have a gathering or a potluck or like a community sort of harvest meal. Has anybody ever been to a potluck before? We get that from Native Americans. They called them potlatches, where they would bring meals. This would be like Thanksgiving, right? If you've ever gone to Thanksgiving with other families, you're probably asked to bring food, right? You do realize Thanksgiving, we haven't acknowledged that as a holiday. we didn't start acknowledging it as a holiday until the Civil War, okay? But people have taken part in harvest festivals since the colonial period. House raisings, barn raisings, apple parings, quilting bees to make quilts, husking bees to shuck corn, merrymaking, dances, horse races were big, stage plays, card playing, billiards, horse racing, cockfighting, fox hunting, a lot of gambling in colonial America. I don't know if you realize this, one of the most famous colonial gamblers, George Washington. He'd gamble on anything. Loved to bet. Lotteries were universally approved, even by churches. This was a way for them to raise money. Colleges also used lotteries. In fact, laws were made to protect lottery winners as they exist today. Obviously, they look very different. Holidays were celebrated throughout the colonies. Birthdays, harvests, Christmas. And then we have some colonial, this is a colonial horse racing reenactment in Williamsburg. And then I've got a little image of a colonial horseback rider on the top right. And then I've got a map just kind of showing you, we got our 13 colonies here. Bless you. Right? We got all this is New France. All that's New Spain. But hey, when the revolution is over, all that is going to come into the hands of the United States. That's going to be purchased by the United States. This is going to be purchased by the United States. So America is going to be growing, over the course of this semester in terms of land acquisition. Any questions for me? Okay.